Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this special event. This is something I've never done before. Oops, got a bit of feedback. Okay, got rid of that. And that's hopefully the technical troubles out of the way. If there are any more, then please do let me know by writing in the live chat, which for most of you, I think will be at the right-hand side of your screen. So I'm Rupert Read. I was going to be giving a talk in Chichester to Extinction Rebellion there, but of course that, along with nearly everything else, has been cancelled. So we thought of what we'd do, and we thought, well, this is going to be the way we do things for the foreseeable future, or at least the immediate future. So let's give it a try. And I'm very grateful to those who've made this event possible, and I hope you enjoy it. And I'm just going to plunge in now, really. I'm going to talk for a fair while because there's a lot to cover. And then later on, there'll be a chance, obviously, for me to respond to your questions that will appear in the live chat. If you have questions you want me to answer, the best thing to do is to hold those back for later, because they'll be gone by the time I get to finishing my talk as the chat streams forward. But you can always make comments or whatever as you go along to be involved and to connect with each other and so on. All right, so I want to start off by saying, will we look back on this time and say something like, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times? And it seems to me that it is entirely possible that that is exactly what we will do. It seems to me that this moment is obviously horrible and tragic, and as I will discuss, also stupid, but that every such moment for human beings contains within it an enormous opportunity. And that the special thing about us as a species and as aware beings and as historical beings is precisely that we do have the opportunity to turn crisis into opportunity. So the talk I was going to be giving this evening was going to be called What If We Looked Down? About the climate and ecological crisis, of course. And what I'm going to be talking about is partly that and partly the more immediate corona crisis that has now hit us. Because, of course, the two are not disconnected. They are connected in all sorts of interesting and troubling ways. And I will try to bring out some of those ways in the course of my talk. So this, as I say, this talk here this evening is an experiment. Let's hope that it works. What I want to get out of it, among other things, is a sense of the revised sense I hope we can come to have of the very dangerous, unnatural experiment that we're conducting with our atmosphere and with our ecosystems, and of the very dangerous experiment that I'm afraid our government and some other governments are conducting right now upon us. So I quoted earlier from Dickens, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. Is that how we will come to look back on this moment? As I've said, the reason why it could be that way is that very often that is the way things go for human beings. So, for example, when people look back on the Second World War, those who didn't die in it, what many of them say, they're getting old now, of course, but what many of those who are still alive say, or what many of us will have read in their memoirs and so on and so forth, is that actually it was a great time to be alive because there was an extraordinary community spirit. People talk, of course, in this country about the Blitz spirit, because people had a sense of what was important in their lives again. Because also various changes in society occurred during, not even just after the war, when of course they occurred with the 1945 Great Reforming Government, but during the war already. For example, with food rationing. Food rationing brought a great deal of equality to this country, which had been missing before. Are we about to see food rationing return to Britain? I don't think it's impossible that that's what we're about to see, because unfortunately, some of our behavior in the supermarkets and so forth has not been exemplary. And although a lot of people are going to a lot of trouble to make sure that stuff gets well shared, that may have to be regimented a little more. If we do get food rationing in this country, a lot of people would be thinking, oh, that's going to be terrible. That's going to be awful. I won't be able to get what I want. And it's already, of course, heading in that direction. Have you noticed that supermarkets are reducing the number of different lines that they stock quite considerably? They're simplifying so that it's simpler for their shelves to be stacked and so that more can be produced of what is actually needed. We're getting a sense, are we not, at this time, of the difference between the concept of wants and the concept of needs. Our consumer society has been built around the concept of wants, but now we're being forced back onto the concept of needs. And in one way, that's really scary and can be really unpleasant and limiting. In another way, it could be liberating and certainly could be good for those who have not been able to satisfy all their wants in our extraordinarily unequal society. So will this turn out to be the best of times as well as the worst of times? Well, that all depends. That all depends on us. It is possible. Let's talk a little bit about the nature of the crisis as we see it right now. Well, right now in Italy, one person is dying every 10 minutes, and more people, I mean of coronavirus, not just of anything. And more people have died because of this epidemic, this pandemic now in Italy than have died in China. And that's pretty scary if you're looking at that from the perspective of the UK, because we are hot on the heels of Italy. We are heading in their direction, and in fact, the line of our number of cases and deaths is, if anything, even steeper than theirs. So 1 every 10 minutes right now in Italy. Here's another statistic, which some of you might have heard in 1 or 2 of my talks before, if you've ever heard these talks before. One species is dying every 15 minutes in our planet. One species is going extinct roughly every 15 minutes. And that's also an extremely chastening statistic. I hope you'll agree. And that's all the time, day in, day out, year in, year out. So with regard to what's happening in Italy, where things are still getting worse, they're behind the clock, although they're catching up. We are way behind the clock in this country. I'll talk about that more. And to go to the bigger climate and ecological crisis, we are as a species way behind the clock in catching up with putting right what we're doing to other species and what we're doing to our atmosphere. And when I say, of course, I noticed someone in the chat saying the worst of times have yet to come. That is absolutely correct. Again, with regard to both crises, the lines of cases and deaths are still going up from coronavirus, and they will go up a lot further. How much further they go up will depend upon what we do and what our government does and what other governments do to some extent and what corporations do. In the case of the climate and ecological emergency, it is bound to get worse also for a long time to come, and just how much worse depends on what we do. Why is it bound to get worse? Well, especially in relation to climate, the main reasons are, firstly, that even if we stopped tomorrow, the vicious feedbacks that we've now started to fuel would carry on getting worse for a while. So, for example, the ice melt in the Arctic and Antarctic. Another reason is simply that there is pretty good reason to believe that the stored carbon in the atmosphere will continue to overheat our atmosphere for some time to come after we stop chucking more up there into the atmosphere. And finally, of course, we're not going to stop emitting tomorrow, although we are emitting now a lot less climate deadly greenhouse gases than we have been for a very long time because of this crisis. And I will come back to the corona crisis. And I'll come back to that point. So that crisis too is going to get worse for a long time to come. Now, mentioning the ecological crisis, because we've always got to remember that the climate crisis is part of a broader ecological crisis. Mentioning the ecological crisis, let's remember also that there is good reason to believe that this disease, this pandemic, comes from eco-destruction. It might be called a warning from nature. We're getting more of these pandemics because our climate is changing, but also more specifically because we are destroying habitat, because we are eating other species at a rate unparalleled in history. And it's probable, it appears now, that this pandemic comes from a pangolin. pangolin, a cruelly persecuted creature, probably eaten by somebody, obviously, in China. And then we got a zoonotic disease, which means a virus that hops over from nature to ourselves. As I say, there will be more pandemics if this goes on. And I'll also come back to the connection later in the talk between these pandemics and globalization. Okay, so there's a bit of an overview of some of the nature of these two crises that we face. And to come back to the question which I titled this talk with before this epidemic had started, what if we look down? What I want to urge you to do, it's very, very hard, but what I want to urge you to do is really look into the face of these crises, to not shy away from them. The reason why Extinction Rebellion has had the tremendous success it has had over the last year, the reason why Greta Thunberg and the school climate strikers have had the extraordinary impact that they've had over the last year is primarily because, in a way that's never happened before, we've encouraged people, enabled people, in a certain sense, if you will, forced people, starting with ourselves, to tell the truth, which is Extinction Rebellion's first demand, and to look the appalling crisis that we have created, that our species has created, in the face. And only if we do that are we actually in a position to rise up to meet it. Only if we do that are we actually in a position to be our best selves, to possibly make it, in a certain sense, amidst all the carnage and horror and grief, into the best of times. And the exact same thing applies to the corona pandemic. We have to be willing to face this, because if we don't, we're not going to be willing to take the serious measures that are going to be needed to take it, to make it get more fully under control. And let's be very, very clear, in countries like the UK and the US right now, as I speak, on the 19th of March, this pandemic is very, very far from being under control. So let's drill down into a few specifics of the pandemic. I've already mentioned what's going on in Italy and the horror story there, and the very brave efforts there by the health services to fight the pandemic. The way that the population, as far as I can tell, are doing a pretty good job now of buckling down and doing the things that need to be done to control this outbreak, including a massive, massive lockdown. I watched a very interesting video the other night. This video was messages from Italian people to themselves 10 days ago. Right, what they wish they had said to themselves 10 days ago, what they wish they had known 10 days ago. And you can probably work out what was in most of those messages. They were basically saying, look, take it a lot more seriously than you're inclined to take it. Stop going to bars sooner. Start taking precautionary measures like washing your hands, simple stuff like that, sooner. Start putting pressure on the government and others sooner to change their ways. Italy has learned by bitter experience. The experience in Asia has also been bitter, but of course, what's happened in China and South Korea and so forth in recent weeks is really remarkably successful. The UK, I'm afraid, looks like being the worst failed experiment of them all. As I speak to you right now, I've just listened to the Prime Minister's latest announcement at the latest news conference, and there don't appear to be any new measures today, even though people were expecting measures towards some kind of shutdown, lockdown, at least in some aspects of what's going on in London, but none of that. Now, don't get me wrong, the situation here in the UK is a lot better in terms of the government response than it was a week ago. A week ago, we had the announcement of the absolutely appalling and insane, unbelievable herd immunity policy, which when a great Harvard epidemiologist heard about it, he said, well, that's obviously a satire, it's obviously a joke. No country would actually have that as its policy. And he then had to be told, no, that is the UK policy. The UK has gone way out on a limb in not putting into place precautionary measures, in not learning from the experiences of other countries, especially the East Asian countries, but also, of course, what's been happening in Italy. And here's a very, very important point. If it wasn't for the British people's response, including, of course, the response of epidemiologists and behavioral psychologists, and advocates of the precautionary principle, such as myself, will come back to the precautionary principle. But much more importantly than any of that, the response of ordinary people, the response of many people around this country who started to say, hang on, we're not having this. We're not just going to go along with a government which appears to be blind to what's happened successfully in the Far East, blind to the emerging catastrophe in Italy, blind to the obvious results of its own policy. A back of the envelope calculation, which I and many others did, showed very clearly that if the British government had gone ahead with its policy and let coronavirus rip across the population, even if it had managed to cocoon a lot of older people from that letting rip, it was virtually certain to overwhelm the NHS, in particular to overwhelm intensive care units, to run out of ventilators. It would have been a vast public health disaster. It's quite extraordinary that the policy was dreamed up in the first place. A back of the envelope calculation made it obvious that it was far, far too risky to allow to go ahead. And as I say, the thing which has really encouraged me is it's been the people's response, not everybody's response, but a response of an awful lot of people getting concerned about themselves, getting concerned about their parents, their grandparents, etc., which has moved the government, which has forced the government incrementally in the right direction. They're still by no means there yet. I'll come back to that point, but they have moved in the right direction compared to where they were a week ago. As I speak to you here, I'm at my home in Norwich rather than in Chichester, where this talk was going to have taken place. I've just come back from a few days in London, and I want to share with you the experience that I had there. So I was in London because I was doing some TV about the crisis, and because I was with my wife, who has a flat in London, and seeking to help her to be ready to leave her flat, which she'll be hopefully doing tomorrow, and coming here if, as now seems likely, there'll be no travel restrictions, which there should be being placed by now. So my experience in London, I want to share with you in case you are somebody who is not in London and not in Lombardy and so on and so forth, and hasn't seen what's happening and what's coming. What's happening so far in London is not nearly enough, and in particular, there's been no serious government action yet whatsoever in London, no compulsion. But London is a very different place from what it was a few weeks ago when I was last there. I'll just tell you what I experienced in London the last few days. In London now, you see very commonly people wearing masks, and a good thing too when they're around a lot of other people. People wearing gloves. I was wearing latex disposable gloves whenever I was out, which wasn't very often at all, of course. People are being asked or compelled not to go into shops or small spaces in large numbers. I mean, compelled by the shopkeepers, not by the government. The numbers on the streets, the numbers on public transport, etc., have dramatically fallen. When I was in London, I took no public transport whatsoever. I mostly walked, including long distances. I also took a few overground train rides at sparse times of day. And London is now approaching somewhere vaguely near where it needs to be, although still not where it actually needs to be. So if you're watching this in, I don't know, Norwich perhaps, or North Wales, or if you're watching this from some part of the United States perhaps, what I want to say to you is what is happening in London right now, that will be happening soon where you are, or at any rate it will, unless much stronger measures are put in place to reduce movement of people, and so on and so forth. So do get ahead of the curve. The only way one can stay ahead of the virus is to get ahead of the curve and move in the kind of direction that, as I say, has been successfully practiced, as we know, in East Asia. Where London needs to be is much more locked down than it is, or at least moving in that direction. If that does not happen, I I foresee tragically that Britain will, within a few weeks, potentially be the worst in the whole world in terms of casualties, although that's entirely possible that'll be wrong. It could be the United States, it could be parts of the global south, which of course are in many cases much less well prepared in terms of their health services than we are, although our health service is not nearly as prepared as other health services are, such as the German health service. So I hope that little report from London is helpful in trying to make it real to you. It felt quite unreal to be briefly out on the streets of London, wearing a mask, perhaps wearing my latex gloves, taking care not to get too close to people, meeting up with a friend, not hugging this friend, not going within 2 meters of this friend, and so on and so forth. That is the kind of place we are heading if we are going to stay safe. And this is what I've been arguing for some time on the basis of my academic work on the precautionary principle, as have my colleagues, Nassim Taleb, Yania Bar-Yam, Joe Norman, who've been doing a heroic job of arguing this in the United States. Precautionary measures are what you take when you are not fully in control of a situation, when you're in a world that you don't fully understand. And there's so much that we don't understand about this virus. We don't know quite how bad it is. We don't know, for example, whether it might have long-term neurological damage effects or long-term lung damage effects. There's some reason to believe already that it might have those kinds of effects. I mean, in people who recover from it. And also stepping back to think of the pandemic on a more general precautionary basis, we've never had a serious pandemic in a globally physically interconnected world before. Right? The last pandemic of this kind of gravity was 100 years ago. It was the Spanish flu pandemic, which cut through a very weakened population after the Second World War. There were virtually no commercial air flights whatsoever at the time of the Spanish flu. It was a very different world. Everything moved in that sense a lot slower. Our world now is a lot more risky in that way. It's a lot more joined up. The only way we could have made ourselves safe, the way to have taken precautions properly in relation to a potential global pandemic, was to have reversed things, to have made the world more like that. You see what I'm getting at? We need to create a situation where it's possible for nations and regions and communities to seek to look after themselves, to keep disease out, and where necessary, where it has entered in, to self-isolate, not just on an individual basis, but on a collective basis. That's the responsible thing to do. That's the helpful thing to do. That is what the World Health Organization is asking for. Okay, so to broaden now a bit from the pandemic to the precautionary principle more generally, the precautionary principle is a general point about protecting yourself against potential risks. When you're not sure how bad something is going to be, then err on the safe side. Better safe than sorry. Look before you leap. These are all simple ways of getting into the spirit of the precautionary principle. And just as in the last couple of months, we mostly, especially in this country, have not applied the precautionary principle until very recently to corona, so the precautionary principle has mainly not been applied to the climate and ecological emergency. And there it's had the same, there's been the same need for it, the same long-term case for it. But there too, we've been way behind the curve. And I want to just remark that those scientists, very, very, very few, and those corporate apologists and others who say things like, we need to have absolutely full evidence before we move on anything. We need to know everything before we take serious action about any alleged threat. Those people are being reckless. They're being the opposite of precautious. That was the way that cigarette companies defended themselves. They said, oh, more research is needed to be sure that smoking causes cancer. That was the way that there's been prevarication on climate action. That is the way that right now some people are saying, well, maybe we don't need all these species that are going extinct. That is a line which is tragically from a small, pathetic, beleaguered minority on the increase. And that is the same kind of line that has been taken by those who said, well, maybe this pandemic isn't going to be that bad. Yeah, maybe it isn't going to be that bad, although it's looking pretty fucking bad. But that's not a good bet to take, right? When you're not sure how bad something is going to be, err on the safe side, because the downside that you're exposed to is always potentially worse than the upside. Here's a very simple analogy for thinking about that. I don't take flights anymore. I don't fly anymore. And perhaps some of you are in that category, but many of us will have flown. And I remember when I used to fly that there were occasions when my plane was 1, 2, 3, 6, 8 hours late. How many times have you been on a plane and it arrived 8 hours early? Right? The answer is never. Yeah, that's not possible. But the amount it could be late is open-endedly bad, if you will, right? Could be 8 hours, it could be 8 days, etc. If there's some kind of total breakdown, if there's something like what we're seeing at the moment. The downside, the potential downside that you're exposed to from a potentially serious threat, and we're talking about threats that are far, far more serious than just being late with your flight, is always potentially larger than the upside. And what that implies is that the reckless attitude is always the wrong attitude to take. 9 times out of 10, it might work out fine, but on the 10th time, you will totally come a cropper. And that's what's happening right now. And that's the fundamental attitude that needs to change. I guess one of the things that gives me a little bit of hope in relation to the current crisis that we're going through with Corona is, well, perhaps people are going to wake up to that some. Perhaps especially in countries like this one. They're going to look back on the unnecessary death toll that we're going to be suffering here. And they're going to say, wow, if only we had listened more carefully to those voices, the voice of the Lancet, the voice of those who are urging precaution, the voice of those who are urging that we learn from the East Asian experience. If only we had listened more quickly to the voices that said, hey, this could be really bad. Let's start taking seriously these precautious measures. And as I say, the analogy in relation to climate and ecology on a longer time scale is quite close. All right, let me drill down a little bit more into the sense in which we are experiencing something extraordinary right now. So right now, if you're anything like me, you're probably a bit scared. You're certainly a bit discombobulated. We're suddenly having an experience of great vulnerability, yeah? We're experiencing an emergency. We're worried about ourselves. We're probably much more worried about older people. Some of us, such as myself, have medical conditions that make us vulnerable, and we're certainly worried about ourselves. I'm immunosuppressed, and there are lots of people out there who are not in their 80s who are potentially vulnerable to this disease. Don't fall into the illusion of thinking that it's only old people who die from this. We're seeing now plenty of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s tragically dying in this country, and more so in other countries such as Italy and France. So we are experiencing in real time a situation of great vulnerability. We are experiencing an emergency. And that's something which for many of us is basically something new. We are perhaps familiar with the way in which our parents or grandparents experienced that in the Second World War. Some of us have personal experience from perhaps being in war zones or something, or we know people who are, absolutely living on the edge, perhaps in parts of the global south. But for many of us in countries like the UK, this is a new experience and it's very disturbing. And sometimes it feels a bit unreal. Being in London earlier today felt a little bit unreal to me sometimes. Wow, am I really having to think, about every single place where I put my hand and try to make sure I've got my disposable glove on at the right moment, that kind of thing. That experience of vulnerability is an experience which I think really gives the lie to the way in which we've been lulled into a false sense of security. We've been taught that we are this incredibly powerful species, that we have dominion over nature, that we have mastery over nature, that we are engaged in a process of inevitable historical progress allegedly, where everybody's going to get richer forever, and there's going to be better and better medicine, and that, yeah, this is a kind of infinite end of history situation. Now, I'm sure that many of you that I'm speaking to are very skeptical of that idea, but what we are getting right now is a kind of disproof of that idea, and it's hitting a lot of people quite hard. What might be the upside of this down? Now, what might be the best that could come out of this worst, out of this scariness, out of this necessity to face up to the reality of our situation? Well, what it might be is that we start to adopt a position of a little more humility, that we start to understand a little better that we are not really masters of nature, that if we try to dominate and rule this planet, that will come back to bite us. And that this is as true in relation to the climate and in relation to ecology as it is in relation to pandemics. And if we were to manage to have that kind of realization, that would be enormous progress. That would be a real progress of a kind, because that would be a kind of gain of wisdom, not just a sort of technological fix, not just an alleged greater power that we have, but an actual wisdom, an actual sense of where we fit in a little bit better and what's possible for us, and of the potential blowback that we get when we try to master nature and when we try to endlessly progress, when we try, for example, to endlessly grow the economy, which is a point perhaps that we'll come back to. And you know what? Talking of that word, the economy, isn't it the case that over the past 20, 30, 40, perhaps more years, we've been kind of worshipping the economy as a god? And our society's become all about this thing, the economy, this abstraction, growing the economy. And right now, of course, and completely understandably and rightly so, there's a lot of panic and concern about, my God, what's going to happen to the economy? Is the economy going to go into a tailspin that'll make 2008 look relatively minor? But, you know, I think there's something, and we can come back to that. We can talk about it, and we can talk about what we should do about that. But I want to make a different point, because I think it's even more important. I think that we're learning something right now about what really matters. Something about how the economy is not as important as it's been cracked up to be. Sure, as I say, obviously, it's a matter of enormous concern. Obviously, people who are losing their jobs, you know, they ought to be given an absolute guarantee by this government. It's an obvious time to bring in something like a citizen's income for all. And that kind of thing should be happening around the world increasingly right now because of the nature of this crisis. But what I'm trying to get at is that people are realizing that there's something even more important than the economy. There's something even more important than GDP, that those kinds of things can be fixed, that government can do stuff, and that companies and people and so on can do stuff to sort out the economy, to bring in things like people's quantitative easing, which is right on the cards now. Again, wasn't even really under serious discussion until this latest crisis. And what I'm trying to get at that is even more important than the economy is life. Right? When you're staring down the barrel of something that could kill you, or that could kill your parents, or that could kill your uncle and aunt, or that is killing people right now in this country and in significantly larger numbers already on the continent of Europe, that focuses your gaze, that forces you to stare at reality in a certain way and to see what is actually important, and to realize, I believe and hope and think, that we can come to see, sorry, that's my phone, should have turned that off before we started, another little technical glitch, to come to see that what matters more than those abstract numbers is whether we live or die. What matters is the love we have for each other. What matters is the care that we can give each other. So, for example, I mentioned that in London I met up with a friend. We had a little discussion at a suitable distance, and we weren't able to hug each other. And it may be that it's quite a long time, unless we get a lot more testing going on in this country, which we bloody well should do. It's quite a long time before you'll be able to randomly hug friends and so forth again. You know what? When we get to the point that we are able to do that again, assuming we do get to it, assuming we have that good fortune, aren't we going to value that so much more? Isn't it going to be such a special thing? Aren't we going to really appreciate it? Aren't we going to be in that moment in the kind of way we're in the moment, some of us meditatively, that we appreciate? In meditation, you're really present in the moment. You really appreciate all of it in its quality, even if it isn't something sort of extraordinary objectively. I think we're going to appreciate the quiddities of ordinary life so much more when we get to the point of being able to experience them again without the fear of what goes along with them at the present time. And that, to me, is something which gives enormous hope. That, to me, is something which gives enormous hope, because it says that maybe there's something more important than what we've been taught to think is the most important thing over the past generation or two. And again, maybe that can be the basis for a kind of reset. Oh my God, sorry about this. I've got to, okay, that stopped. Good. We learn this on the job, right? Next time I do it, I'm sure it'll be smoother. Yeah. So where did I want to go from there? Okay, so yes, the idea of resetting, the idea of getting a sense of what's important that hopefully we're not going to let slip, that hopefully we're going to hold onto as something precious. Just like we're, when I said goodbye to my wife earlier today, not completely certain that I'll see her tomorrow or for quite a while if there are suddenly massive restrictions on movement. There's a real authentic and deep appreciation there that is not necessarily always available to us and not easy for us, but that's something we should remember and something we should hold on to. Love, life, care, the way that people, for example, are already starting to reach out in big numbers and trying to set up mutual aid with the vulnerable in their communities, with people who are self-isolating, with the elderly, and so on and so forth. That is something enormously hopeful. And that is something we could hold on to if and when and as this crisis diminishes, because you know what, funnily enough, it's exactly what we need to make life as good as it possibly can be. And it's exactly what we're going to need in order to fight the even bigger, longer term struggle of the climate and ecological emergency. And that takes me to the question of sort of what comes next. Now, it's far too early to look into this in any very serious way. What we need to be doing right now is that kind of mutual aid. What we need to be doing right now is pressuring the government to move much faster to save lives by taking the kinds of measures that are so desperately needed in order to do that, have been argued for, as I say, by a number of us for weeks and months, in fact, now, but are still, some of them, not happening. What is needed right now is to repurpose some industry so that instead of producing cars, say, we're producing ventilators and respirators and testing kits and so on and so forth. But there will come a time, there will almost certainly with this pandemic come a time when we pass the peak and the emergency starts to diminish. And then it will be incredibly tempting to just flick back to normal, to reset to where we were before. And I want to say to you, friends and colleagues, I want to say to you, that is something we need to be ready to stop. We need to be ready to say, no, let's learn from the things that have gone well here. Let's learn from what we've created in terms of community spirit. Let's learn from the sense that we've had, and I have absolutely no doubt that this will be the case, that a lot of people who are now working from home will say, you know what, I don't want to go back to commuting. Let's learn from the greater ability we're going to have that we're trying to experiment with right here and now to do things online, which are better done online. Lots of things should be done in person, right? Nonviolent direct action, most forms of it better done in person. Hugging, better done in person. But there's plenty of things that work better online, Do you really need to go on that foreign junket to a conference, or could you make your talk there by Skype? Do you need to see your far-flung relative as often as you've been used to seeing them? Of course it's nice, but maybe you could actually make do with with Skype or whatever, FaceTime. And maybe if you're going to take a trip to see them, you take it more as a kind of special thing that you value in the way that I was saying a few minutes ago. We can now really properly value perhaps a hug as something really rare and beautiful and loving. Perhaps if you've got a relative in, I don't know, Australia or Myanmar, perhaps you might take a once-in-a-lifetime trip to see them by boat and train or something like that. And wouldn't that be the most special and extraordinary thing? Can intergovernmental conferences be done online? The climate COP is supposed to be happening later this year at Glasgow. It's already in doubt, and the pre-meetings are in grave doubt, which is very worrying from a climate perspective. But along with an XR colleague, I put out a petition to say, look, let's try to do the COP online. Can that be done? It would need a lot of help for the poorer nations to make sure that they were adequately set up technologically for that. But it would be good to do that under the present circumstances, and maybe it would be better to do it anyway. I know that many of us have thought for many years that it really jarred with the idea of having climate negotiations, to have all these leaders and civil servants and so on flying into them, jetting into them at the last minute and so forth. That something about that seemed just kind of really fake and stupid. There are things, and I've given a number of examples of different kinds of them now. There are things we can be and should be learning from this crisis in terms of best practice, in terms of how we could reset or reboot in a different way. And I want to add another one now, that it has to be said that this kind of pandemic is a completely predictable outcome of economic globalization. And in fact, not just predicted broadly. I mentioned the possibility in my book, This Civilization is Finished. Nassim Taleb, my colleague, mentioned it in much more detail in his book, The Black Swan. If you have massive international physical interconnectivity, very, very rapid, and also on top of that, if you have the kind of destruction of ecosystems and the kind of overturning of animals and the incorporation of strange animals into our bodies in novel ways, and to the extent that it's been happening over the past generation, it just is going to be the case that sooner or later you will have a pandemic like this, and it'll be much harder to control than pandemics used to be when they moved at the pace of a camel or of a sailing ship rather than of a jet plane. So the future is going to be more local. The future is going to be a place where the excesses of globalization as we know it are gone. That will be forced upon us by the climate and ecological emergency, or by collapse if we don't wake up to that emergency in time. And it's already being, to some extent, forced upon us by this COVID-19 outbreak. Something that was, I must mention, sort of relatively pleasant in London the last few days is that while I was there, the flights, overhead flights, much less than I've been used to when I've stayed in London, and I have many, many times before. I was brought up under a Heathrow flight path. Much easier to sleep, much more pleasant when there's no flights or few flights going overhead. There are still some, and there's still too many, frankly. But I mean, too many from a corona point of view, from a safety point of view right now. The future will be more local. There will be less flying in the future, or there will be no future. That again is a sense in which this is a warning from nature, and it's one that we could heed. And if we did heed it, we could make our lives better. And this is a concept of mine that a few of you will probably already be familiar with. I call it the beautiful coincidence. That the very things we need to do in order to address the climate and ecological emergency are by and large the very things we need to do in order to actually make our lives better. More trust, knowing your neighbors, less loneliness, more, better, healthier, local food, being fitter, less reliant on cars, less reliant on air travel, less noise, and so on and so forth. Now, it's obvious that there are features of this corona crisis which are horrific, starting, of course, with the death and the suffering, but also including this difficulty of the so-called social distancing that I prefer to call physical distancing, because we mustn't let it be social distancing, friends. We must stay socially connected even when there's 2 meters between us, or even when we're talking down the phone or having a meeting like this, rather than in person. There are aspects of this crisis which are horrible and terrible, and there are aspects of this crisis which have within them the seeds of something much better. And we must grow those latter ones, and we can. I absolutely strongly believe that we can. All right, I'm approaching towards the end of the remarks that I wanted to make. Perhaps I'll briefly come back to this little book, This Civilization is Finished, which you can get for free online as an ebook. If you go back up to the top of the chat, I've left the link there for it. Some people, when they hear that title, some people, when they hear me say this civilization is finished, they think that I'm a doom monger. They think I'm saying that everything's done for. Now, obviously, a moment's reflection should show that that can't be what I'm saying, because I'm in an extinction rebellion, right? And what we're trying to do is rebel against our possible extinction and rebel against the extinction of other species that is going on right now, as I mentioned earlier. So it should be clear, and I hope it's not a surprise to any of you to hear that I believe that there is always hope. There is always hope to make things less bad, and there is always something better that can come out of something bad or worse in the ways I've been describing during this talk this evening. So what do I mean then by this title, This Civilization is Finished? Well, here's what I mean, that I think that it's entirely possible that this civilization will collapse. I think that this particular pandemic is very unlikely to collapse it. A future pandemic could do, because they're probably going to be more coming after this, and they're probably going to be worse. Or if that doesn't do us in, then we're on the path straight towards the climate and ecological emergency doing us in. That collapse might not be terminal. It need not be terminal. And in fact, I believe that it's quite likely not to be terminal. In other words, collapse would be a horrendous catastrophe. It would be the kind of thing experienced, famously in the Roman Empire and the Mayans and many other cases in human history. It would involve almost certainly mass death, not to mention untold suffering and devastation. But out of that collapse could come a new civilization, and it might be a civilization that had learnt from some of the things that we have not adequately learnt from as yet. But there is a third possibility as well. The first possibility that we simply collapse and that's it. Second possibility that we collapse, but that we recover from that collapse and build a new civilization out of the wreckage. The third possibility is that we transform everything really fast, really deeply, really profoundly, really seriously, in such a way that we don't collapse. And that looks very unlikely. It has been looking very unlikely to anyone who's really willing to face climate and ecological reality. Anyone who's really willing, as I put it, following Paul Kingsnorth, to look down and to see, like one of those famous cartoon characters, that we're motoring our legs over the edge of the cliff. And that's not a good position to be in. But that third possibility is real and is conceivable. It's not over till it's over. However, the reason I say that this civilization is finished is that even if we manage to achieve that third possibility, the transformation will be so profound. It'll be the kind of thing that the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm change. The transformation will be so profound that in no meaningful sense will the civilization that emerges on the other side of this crucible that is coming be the same as the one that we live in. And that's why I mean that this civilization is finished, because if we manage to not collapse, we will have changed everything. We will have a new civilization, and in many ways it will be far better than this one. And so the point that I want to end with, before I turn to your chat and try to answer some of your questions, is this: that the claim I would make at this difficult, scary inflection moment is that the coronavirus offers us a kind of opportunity. Amidst the horror, it offers us an opportunity to start to move in the direction of that changed civilization. A changed civilization which would be less likely to yield pandemics, which would be not condemning us on the path to climatological and ecological destruction. A civilization which would be manifesting the beautiful coincidence that I mentioned a few minutes ago. A civilization that would inevitably be more local. I hope that we can keep the benefits, the actual benefits of cosmopolitan globalization, that we can keep things like Skype, that we can keep in touch with information and learning from around the world, that where necessary, we can face environmental challenges like the climate challenge, but as long as we need to, together as a species. But it is certain that if there is going to be a human future, it will in many ways be physically and economically more local. And we get a chance to start to experience that right now. Our supply chains in this coronavirus crisis are already coming under incredible strain. They're going to come under much more strain in the months ahead. And by the way, don't be under the illusion that that we're all going to be home before Christmas, as it were. This crisis is going to go on in one way or another, certainly for several months, probably for a year, possibly for 2 years. It could be permanent, like the climate emergency is permanent, because the coronavirus could become endemic. So the point that I'm making is that we get the chance to learn, to see now in the mirror of this virus who we really are, and to decide who we're going to be. Are we going to be those people who are preventing old people from getting the basic supplies that they need in a supermarket? Or are we going to be the people who are helping them to do that? Are we going to be the people who are saying this Chinese virus? Or are we going to be the people who are offering mutual aid and love and understanding that in a certain very real sense, we are all in this one together? Are we going to be the people making this the worst of times, or are we going to make it the best of times? Are we going to create something wonderful out of this horrendous situation that we've been accidentally, but also in some sense, unsurprisingly, delivered into? I think that the coronavirus crisis, amidst the horror of it, it could be the making of us. It could be what enables us to put ourselves onto a path of not having a civilization that collapses. And that is, in these dark times, an encouraging thought. Thank you so much for listening. Perhaps you're cursing at this point, perhaps you're applauding. I don't know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to the remarks that I know a lot of you have been making in the chat and the questions, and I'm going to start to take on some of those. All right, so what have we got here? And we've got a lot of interesting and diverse stuff. And I'm going to start with the, actually, I'm going to go right back up to the top, and I'm going to answer the question that was put by Philip Maber that I noticed earlier, who asks an interesting question. Given that most of the XR campaigning effort is targeted at persuading national and local government to radically act according to the truth about climate change, do you agree that the most effective way to achieve this is by electing Green Party representation en masse? So, I am a member of the Green Party. People in XR are members of all parties and no party. But I'm still not going to give really a straight affirmative answer to the question. The reason why I'm so active in XR is because I think that our political system is broken. I think that our electoral system is obviously broken, but more broadly, our political system is broken. Our political system is not delivering the kind of action that we so desperately need and hasn't done for a long time on the climate and ecological emergency. And our political system also seems to be letting us down pretty badly in relation to this corona crisis. I haven't been hugely impressed, I must confess, with what my Green Party colleagues have been saying in relation to this crisis. They've said some very good stuff about the need, for example, for universal basic income and for help for renters and all sorts of good stuff. But they haven't really embraced the need for a fully precautionary approach. And in that way, they mirror the rest of the political class, that no one really has scrutinized, from among those who are active and elected in politics, no one has really scrutinized this government to the extent that it should have been scrutinized over its response to this crisis. And in that way, it's kind of like the situation vis-a-vis the climate and ecological emergency. Obviously, I think the Green Party's got the best policies on the climate and ecological emergency. But we have to be realistic about, A, does the Green Party have a great chance of getting elected in the near future to do the stuff it needs to do? Of course, Greens are elected all over the place in the London Assembly and local councils and so on and so forth. But is there going to be change at the national level of the kind we need through the Green Party alone? Looks very unlikely. And it looks likely that what the Greens and everybody else needs is Extinction Rebellion to move the dial. And that's what Extinction Rebellion has been trying to do over the last year, and has, I think, done with quite a lot of success. XR has shifted the agenda and boosted the climate and nature way up the list of priorities. This is clear from opinion poll data relative to where it was before. Now we face a kind of interesting moment and a challenge to that, because there will be huge forces now arguing for a return to literally business as usual. We see the oil companies and gas companies, you see the airlines asking for bailouts right now. That is completely wrong, right? It would be completely wrong to jump from the frying pan of the coronavirus into the fire, literally, of the climate emergency. What we ought to be doing is preparing for a future in which we've taken the opportunity to radically reboot and reset. So right now, if you're in XR, if you're in the Green Party, wherever you are, please be opposing those kind of calls for bailouts, or at the very least, we need to have very strict conditions put on those bailouts, such that, for example, if any airline gets any money at all from the government, I don't think it should, but if it does, to support itself during this time, that should be on condition of things like the virtual abolition of first class, much tighter controls on private jets, something like a frequent flyer levy being brought in, and so on. If there are going to be bailouts, they need to be green bailouts and social bailouts. And looking further ahead, as I say, right now, what we need is stuff being repurposed to produce ventilators. But looking further ahead, what we need is stuff being repurposed to produce things like renewable energy, solar panels, etc., on a mass scale. What's known as a Green New Deal. We need a real Green New Deal, which doesn't just try to refloat the balloon of economic growth to make the same old expansion, so-called, of the economy start all over again. No, remember what I said earlier. Let's try to be clear that actually what we want is a future where we have a greener, more intelligent, more socially inclusive economy, but also where the economy is in its place. And we're clear that actually there are things in life that matter more than money, and even matter more in many ways than having a livelihood. And that's things like being alive and love and doing the right thing and being decent to each other. All the qualities that will be challenged to bring out and to realize better during the course of this pandemic. So thanks for that question, Philip. I hope that you answered. That I answered it adequately. Now we've got some interesting comments here that I want to address a little bit more. Josie says that herd immunity was crazy. Alice said, people are waking up to rebellion against the government when the government, have made decisions not in the public interest. Kate said, I agree, herd immunity was in the interest of those who could afford private healthcare. I wonder if any of you had the opportunity to watch my appearance on Russia Today yesterday when I talked about all this. What I said then was very directly on this. I said, this herd immunity strategy, it was crazy. It was obviously crazy. How could anybody not think it was crazy? And I made a bold claim, which I don't like having to make, but I'm afraid I think it's true, which is that no one would put forward a herd immunity strategy for a disease like this, with quite significant death rates of 1, 2, 3, 4%. No one would put forward that kind of strategy unless they didn't really think of themselves as part of that herd. So it's a revealing word, isn't it? The herd. did Boris Johnson think of himself as part of the herd? Did he think, yeah, me and my family will catch this, and then we'll have immunity, and we'll be part of that 70%, which enables herd immunity to work? Herd immunity, of course, normally achieved by a vaccine, not by everybody getting a potentially very dangerous disease. So I'm afraid I have to make the remark that it seems to me that we have a government which was prepared to risk this massive, dangerous experiment on the whole population because they probably fancied that they wouldn't actually be part of the 70% of the population that would be taking that risk. They thought that they would be cocooned along with the old and vulnerable. And that's a very worrying and dangerous situation to be in. Black Betty, I note here, by the way, says, your room is messier than my hair. And yes, I apologize for the messiness of my room. It wouldn't be as messy as this if it weren't for the coronavirus pandemic. I'm afraid I've had to prioritize immediate action and writing and whatever over keeping my room tidy. Practical question: do the masks work then? Well, look, masks are by no means any kind of a panacea, and they're by no means the most important thing. The most important things are things like physical distancing, washing your hands, etc. But there are at least two ways in which masks do work, even if they don't necessarily always achieve the desired result of breathing pure air. One is that they make other people aware of the pandemic and make it more likely, for example, that somebody else will cover their mouth with their hand if they cough. A very simple practical point, right? If somebody's looking at you and you're wearing a mask, they're more likely to be aware, all right, I ought to cover my mouth as well. And also, very important point about masks, if you yourself have the virus, you're less likely to communicate it to somebody else, the virus, if you're wearing a mask. Very, very obvious point. Black Betty again. Let's talk about live meat markets. Do we have global power of over any country's poor decisions? Should we give aid to poor Asian countries in exchange for a promise of a shutdown? Very interesting question. Important here not to get into the business of sort of demonizing those East Asian countries and peoples for the fact that this pandemic has emerged from there. It's quite possible that the next pandemic will come from the Amazon, or for that matter, from a pig farm in Norfolk or whatever. But nevertheless, an interesting question. Is this an example of the kind of thing that we might, as human beings, be able to learn from this crisis? Again, I have at least a little bit of hope that it might be. There must be people right now in China and elsewhere who are thinking something along the lines of, my God, we're taking a risk. We're gambling with many people's lives when we do this kind of stuff. Maybe this might be an example of one of many things where we can actually learn from the crisis. Max says, the data casualties are the same as the common flu of every year. Okay, now look, this is really important to understand. Max is right. The data casualties so far are roughly the same overall. But you need to understand the nature of exponential growth, right? The point about the ordinary flu each year is that there's a limit as to how bad it's going to get. With this, the limit as to how bad it's going to get is way, 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 way higher. The calculations that have been done on what could have happened if the absurd herd immunity so-called policy had gone ahead, as to how many people could have died in this country, are that the numbers could have been between a few 100,000 and 2 million. How do you get to such high numbers? Well, you get to them because this disease kills a far higher percentage of the people it infects than flu, and it's more infectious than flu. And when you overwhelm hospitals, when you overwhelm intensive care units, then you start to get to a situation where your entire health system breaks down, and that means that an awful lot of people who are already medically vulnerable and so on are also going to die. There's a further risk as well, by the way, which I said earlier, I think is very unlikely, but can't be completely ruled out, that there may be breakdowns in social or economic order as a result of this pandemic. And those too could claim further lives. So it's really important, Max, to understand the difference between this disease and the common flu. This disease exposes us to what in technical terms is called a fat tail. It exposes us to a much worse downside than the common flu does. That's why strong precautionary action was essential against it. Okay. Max says you should do this talk with data instead of just talk. Well, look, the data is easy to find. The numbers are easy to find. Go and look at the stuff in the epidemiological studies. Look at what my colleagues Nassim Taleb and Yanni Baryam have been saying, where they've computed the numbers. Look at the actual numbers from China and Italy and so on. I haven't gone into that kind of stuff because other people have done it, and because I'm trying to do something slightly different here, which is to make some connections and to also think. I'm a philosopher by training, to think about the meaning of some of this. Right? You can't, from numbers alone, you can't understand the importance of life versus GDP. Yeah, GDP is a set of numbers, but the issue of how important GDP is compared to how important human life is can't be understood through numbers alone. Numbers alone aren't going to tell you how much love matters or how much you care about whether you can hug someone or not. Numbers alone won't tell you what the prospects are for our being able to achieve some kind of significant change of direction as a society on the back of this crisis. So yeah, I'm trying to do something slightly different there, and I hope it has its own value. Right, let's go down and see what else we have here. Josie says the planet is fighting back. I want to query that. I understand what you mean, and I think, and I was saying something a bit similar when I said that this is a warning from nature, but I don't think it's wise for us to exactly think about this as the planet fighting back. I don't think the planet has real agency. I think that's a mistake to think that it does. And I don't think the planet wants us gone either, even as much as it does have agency, which it doesn't. By that I mean that I think things are in a certain sense on a knife edge. What kind of species are we? What is human nature? It's always something which is up for grabs. It's always something which depends on what we make of ourselves and what we do, and that's what I've been trying to emphasize in the talk earlier, is our agency in this situation, and the way that this crisis, the corona crisis and the climate crisis, the way that there's a call here upon us to step up and to be the best we possibly can be. And when we are that best, we're pretty special and pretty wonderful. I think it would be a great shame if our civilization were to collapse. I think it'd be a really great shame if we were to go extinct. I do think there are other things which are even worse. If we destroyed ourselves and took out the other animals with which we share the world as well, that would be even worse. That would be truly terrible. In particular, I think that we got to make sure that we keep other impressive species around, both for their own sake and to potentially fill the niche if we do completely fuck it up and go the way of the dodo. I myself care a great deal about dolphins, whales, also bonobo chimpanzees, pygmy chimpanzees. Bonobos are extraordinary creatures which are very sort of peace-loving, very good at settling disputes. They like sex a lot, which is cool. And the things which dolphins and the social whales can do, truly extraordinary in terms of the way they'll sacrifice themselves for each other. Their beautiful ceremonies. There's no other word for it that they have. These creatures have cultures. They aren't ours to play with at all. They have their own independent lives and cultures. And one of the absolute worst things that we could do would be to mess up the planet so badly that we mess things up for them as well. But obviously my hope is, and this was the third of the three possibilities I mentioned earlier, my hope is that we may be able to learn from moments like this one, which amidst the horror of them actually do give me some hope. That we may be able to learn how we could move onto a trajectory where it will be us collectively fighting for the planet, rather than having to think about the planet as something that fights back. Realize that all animals are sentient beings. Okay, what have we got here? Yes, Will Fairbrother, yes. Avoiding the flip back to business as usual once this is over is key. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think just one little point I'd like to add on that. We all need to be kind of watching for those tendencies now and later. Now it's about things like opposing airline bailouts. Later it'll be about things like stopping when they try to say, right, back to work as normal, here's your normal commute, etc. Or when they make it difficult for you to take the train, you'd rather take the train to fly to something and get reimbursed for it. Or on a bigger scale, when they say, right, for God's sake, the economy is really massively contracted, we have to expand it again, we have to pump it up again. We need to be watching for those moments. Kate says, it's a warning and pollution is down already. Yeah, and I promised to come back to that point, so here I am, back with it. Thanks for that, Kate. Yeah, pollution is down already, and that is saving lives right now, especially in China, but also elsewhere. But let's be careful here. Let's not prematurely celebrate that. Let's remember again the nature of exponential growth. If this disease really gets out of control in this country or in the US or possibly in Africa, where it's barely got started, possibly because of high temperatures there, we have to hope so. The virus may be sensitive to those high temperatures. We're not really sure of that yet. If this disease really lets rip, it will more than wipe out the deaths that we've saved by the reduced air pollution. But of course, we should learn from the really excellent fact that air pollution has tumbled down in China and in other places. And of course, that's another example of how, when there's pressure to return to business as normal, I was mentioning the air flights earlier and how London is so much less noise polluted now. When there's that pressure to flip back to business as usual, that's again when we should resist. Right, what have we got further down here? Lynn, who is one of the hosts of this talk, very kindly, Lynn asks, how do we build resilience together? Is this something that we should start being taught to our children now? It seems that all generations will need to learn to think in a different way. Yeah, so that's a rich question. How do we build resilience together? So look, here's one thing about the corona crisis, which makes it harder than the climate crisis or the ecological crisis. That the mutual aid that we want to do, that the togetherness that we want to build, that the support we want to give old people, etc., that all these kinds of things, we're having to try to do them in a way, and this is going to be more and more of this. Like I say, if you haven't been in London, let alone Paris and Milan and so on in recent weeks, you're going to be experiencing more and more of this. It's we have to do these things in a way that involve physical distancing. And that's really hard, right? If you manage to crack this this pandemic, say in a year's time or 2 years' time, it's been extirpated, or there are occasional little regrowths of it, and then we get those under control, or we have a vaccine. In a year or two's time, when we perhaps turn our attention more full-bloodedly back to the climate and ecological emergency, which presses on and on, what a joy it's going to be when we can do nonviolent direct action together, for example, shoulder to shoulder and arm in arm, and don't have to be sort of, as it were, looking over our shoulders and saying, Christ, what if that person's infected? What a joy it's going to be, as I said, when we can just kind of go up to an old friend and hug them and don't have to think, am I sure that he's been tested or whatever? there's a sense in which it's going to be easier, that there's a sense in which the incredible life and death against all odds struggle that Extinction Rebellion has been involved with, there's a sense in which it's going to be easier than this struggle that we're involved with now. And that is a hopeful thought. In terms of the different generations, I'd like to make this point, that right now our thoughts are a lot with older people, yeah? So I'm concerned about myself, concerned about me being at risk in this, and I know a number of you are concerned about yourselves. But I'm even more concerned about my mum, because she's got a history of bronchitis, and she is in her late 70s. So she's getting into the seriously vulnerable group, and she's seriously self-isolating now. She lives in London. We need to protect, above all, our old people at this time. And that's the nature, as it happens, of the corona crisis. Now, what about the climate crisis? Well, in the climate crisis, of course, it's our younger people who, above all, need protecting. It's they who are going to face the burden of what the world's going to be like after the ice caps have melted, and after the coral's gone, and perhaps after the Amazon has gone, and much more stuff besides. So I guess one of the things I'm wondering, again, sort of looking forward here a little, is it possible that the love that I hope that we can really strongly manifest in the big challenge of the coming months, is it possible that the love that we can manifest towards the old in the coming months is going to be something that might be able to be repaid towards the young in the coming years and decades? Wouldn't it be wonderful if there are some grandparents, say, who, as they see the way that their children and grandchildren and the younger generation in general and so on are trying to look after them through this crisis, come to a bit more of a realization, perhaps, along the lines of, gosh, yeah, they've really put themselves out to keep us alive. And now it needs to be about us doing what we can to put ourselves out to keep them alive, whether that be nonviolent direct action, or whether that be more intelligent decisions about who to leave your money to in your will. I would urge anyone making a will, and this is a time as we're all thinking of, we're all a little tiny bit at least staring death in the face, where you might think, yeah, I really should have a will. In your will, do you want to just leave your money just in the sort of standard way to your own kids? Or do you want to leave your money to, I don't know, the RSPB? Or do you want to leave your money to a cause which actually could save the future? To put it bluntly, consider leaving your money to an organization like Extinction Rebellion. That might be the best way, ironically, you can actually safeguard the younger generation, including your own. So that's my thought about how this is an issue which has a really interesting relation to the question of the generations. Malk has a question. We have heard that Donald Trump has purposely shut down those previously appointed to look at IPCC reports and make recommendations to the US. Are his actions genuinely a threat to the planet? Well, that's a relatively straightforward question. The answer is yes. And it is deeply embarrassing that as a human being, those pictures of Martians or whatever coming to our planet and saying, take me to your leader, the leader of the free world. I mean, just imagine if Martians landed now, how utterly embarrassing a situation that would be for all human beings, not just Americans. And Trump has again showed his colors a number of times already during this corona crisis as well. Although I must say that on the point of Trump closing some borders, that's not a decision of his that I disagree with. I mean, in relation to this specific crisis, yeah? Again, if you're uncertain about this, look at the way that the crisis has been controlled and is being controlled in the countries where they're working, in China, in Vietnam, in South Korea, in Singapore. Look at the work of Nassim Taleb, Yania Bayam, myself. The stuff that we've been calling for, that if it had been done, it has been in some places, hasn't been in others, there would be less people dead from coronavirus today. But as a general rule, Trump's response to this epidemic has been atrocious. Not quite as bad as Johnson's, but atrocious. And in relation to the climate, Trump is the most dangerous of all, with the possible exception of Bolsonaro of Brazil, who's also cataclysmically dangerous. yeah, Trump is trying to suppress climate science, as you say, and it's absolutely absurd. That's the opposite of facing up to climate reality. That's the opposite of looking down. That's being the equivalent of being an ostrich, and it's terrible and it's terrifying. We have to oppose it rigorously, and that means all sorts of things. But among the things it means, I strongly believe, is getting engaged in nonviolent direct action, because to hope that the existing political and electoral system by itself is enough to end the phenomenon of Trumpism and right populism and so on is, I think, a mistake. So somebody, okay, Josnoff says common flu has much higher death rates. No, that's false. Common flu many years will have roughly similar figures for mortality, but not death rates. The death rate of coronavirus is way higher. So do look into the facts on that. Then we've got some interesting stuff here by Faye. How can we resist the flipped normality? We won't be able to just tell our bosses we want to work from home more, for example. Well, I don't know about that. I think there could be a big upsurge, and in numbers there is strength. I think that if I don't know where you work, Faye, but I think that if people get together at their workplace or in a union or whatever, or if this just happens on a societal wide basis, there's a possibility of a real inflection point here, and people could just find ways of insisting this. I honestly believe that. Faye says, again, maybe we could explore what a year in the future would look like if we held on to the change and used the momentum to achieve big stuff. And I think that's a beautiful thought. I've been trying to do a little bit of that here, but I'd encourage more of you to do more of it, scoping and imagining, It's about imagining a better world, and about imagining how we could take this crisis in the direction of being, as I put it earlier, the best of times rather than the worst of times. The economists who tried to explain to the Queen after the financial debacle of a decade ago how it had happened, they said to her, Mum, there was a collective failure of imagination. We didn't imagine that something as bad and as big as this could happen. That way in which the financial crisis was a sort of black swan event is to some extent reflected in relation to the crisis we're currently experiencing, although, as I say, only to some extent. A lot of what we're experiencing was actually quite predictable, and in some cases predicted even. But the important point is, yeah, it's always about whether you're willing to imagine how bad things could get, so you know what you have to do to head them off, and whether you're willing to imagine how good things could get. It's not about being in a dream world or a fantasy or just being an optimist, not at all, right? It's about looking reality firmly in the eyes, and then on the basis of that, daring to imagine. Richard says, Richard Laverack, the whole UK response is based on cost benefit. The precautionary principle is nowhere in sight. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little more complicated than that. There's a lot of nonsenses going into the whole UK response. So, for example, one thing that's been very important in the response is the reliance on a certain kind of psychology known as nudge thinking, where the idea has been to try to find ways of moving the population a little bit this way, a little bit that way. That kind of thinking is completely inadequate for the kind of crisis that we're in. When you're in a genuine crisis, when you're facing exponentiality, then you can't just nudge. You've got to be able to, you've got to be willing to make really bold steps. You've got to treat it like an emergency. So to come again to the corona climate parallel, we're being thrown into this as an emergency, but our government hasn't adequately faced up to that yet. It's people who are facing up to it much better than the government. In terms of the climate, it's harder to see it as an emergency because it's so much longer. And that's why we need to use phrases like the long emergency or the permanent emergency. But perhaps the vulnerability that we're experiencing now in relation to this crisis will enable us to be clear about the vulnerability we face in relation to the climate and ecological crisis. So in relation to the just-in-time system, for example, it's the same kinds of fragility. It's the same kind of lack of resilience. So we're seeing that just-in-time system under enormous pressure now. Just think of the pressure it could be under somewhat similarly if we have a series of years with bad harvests. And remembering that in this country, we grow only just over half of our own food, which is a really stupid situation to be in. So nudge is not enough. But look, Richard, where I think you're right is that I think it's clear that the government's been sort of focusing more on the economy than on people's lives, which is totally unacceptable. That they've been trying to minimize the interferences with the economy and, in a way, with people's lives in a way which is incredibly short-sighted. And yeah, it has been depressing from a precautionary point of view, and we still have such a long way to go if we're not to have vast, unprecedented numbers being killed, or if you wish to put it more passively, dying of this disease in this country. Kay says, government is revealing itself as incompetent in dealing with coronavirus, but is very adept at communications. How do we reach out to ordinary working people? Well, I don't know. I'm not sure they're that adept at communications. They've been very chaotic and slow and so on. But I think I know what you mean. I think you mean something like they're smooth. They've been clever by doing things like Johnson standing flanked by the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer, so we could make the case that what he was doing was based in science, where, of course, actually it was based in controversial minority science, in psychology, and in the kind of rubbish that we've been talking about in terms of preferences and an unwillingness to take other perspectives seriously at all. Hasn't really been based in science, right? It's been based in various dubious decisions, which are way out of line with the rest of the world, and which were actively undermining the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization needs countries to work together and simultaneously pursue the same strategy. If we had gone down the insane herd immunity route, there would have been enormous numbers of people ill and infected in Britain, and unless the borders had been closed against Britain, unless Britain had been completely isolated from the rest of the world, we would then have reinfected the rest of the world, thus undermining the WHO strategy. But yeah, as I say, Kay, I think I know what you mean. They made it look as though their policy was based in science. They tried to be slick. They've tried to sort of seem reasonable. How do we reach out to ordinary working people? Well, there's lots of answers to that. You know, I hope that, and I get the impression from looking at the chat that a lot of people here are working hard to talk with and to stay in close touch with people that are around them and people that they're meeting and that they're communicating with and so on. And you can do stuff through social media and so on, even if you're already socially, physically isolating and so on and so forth. But I think that the challenge goes even beyond that. Yeah, we do need to have a way of communicating this, which brings home the message to the significant percentage of the UK population who, perhaps because they've been lulled into a false sense of security by the government, have not woken up to this. And there are exactly parallel issues again, of course, in relation to climate and ecology. You know, because the government hasn't declared a climate and ecological emergency, because the government hasn't declared it, because the media don't take it seriously enough, even now, nowhere near seriously enough, because it's not a day-to-day topic of conversation. Many ordinary people sort of get the message that, well, it can't really be that serious, can it? No, it is. It's absolutely deadly serious. And on a shorter time scale, this corona crisis, absolutely deadly serious. So yeah, we need to find ways of making that more obvious and perspicuous to people. I'm afraid that some of those ways are going to be quite a lot easier soon. We're going to get more and more heartbreaking stories, and it's going to get closer and closer to people. You know, I don't know about you, but I've already been experiencing this. You know, first I heard about somebody in XR who had got symptoms of coronavirus. And then a former student of mine told me that they're self-isolating because they have the symptoms. And then my nephew has got the symptoms very strongly, and it's clear that he has got coronavirus. And it gets closer and closer and closer. And by the end of this, unless we're very lucky and unless we're very skillful and a lot of people will know someone who's got it, and a lot of people will know someone who's very ill from it or who's died from it and so on. And as it gets closer to people, it will wake them up more. But of course, the thing is, you have with a virus like this, just as with the climate, where there are also these huge time lags built into the system, you've got to stay ahead of the curve. Let's compare those timescales a little bit. With climate, you've got to stay something like 25 to 30 years ahead of the curve. It's really hard. The climate deadly emissions that we've produced as a human race have been emitted since 1990. In other words, since the science was clear. But the majority of the heating effect has been from emissions that were produced before 1990. Enormous time lag. The time lag with coronavirus is a lot less. It's a few weeks rather than a few decades. But we're seeing in this crisis how even being a few weeks ahead of the game seems too difficult for governments like our government and the American government to do. And that is quite depressing. We need to find ways of making these stories of ill health and death and tragedy and so on that are starting to come out now, and they're coming out from Italy and so on. We need to start to find ways of making those accessible to people now, when we need people to be changing their behavior. Right, we'll have a couple more questions and then we'll stop, because I got to tell you, I'm pretty knackered. This is a high intensity thing, having to speak the whole time and not even be able to put to people. And what you see possible to bring about a new togetherness. Well, you know what, actually, that's a great question to end with. I'm going to try to end with that. So I hope I've already given you quite a lot of an answer to that question. My hope story is that I see already in this corona crisis the seeds of a better solidarity, even despite the difficulty imposed by this whole physical distancing thing. And by the way, if you are getting involved, any of you, in mutual aid, please make sure that you practice that. Yeah, don't go around the streets and some big gaggle of people looking after old people and putting food through their letterboxes or whatever. I know it should be obvious, but unless you've been tested, all of you have been tested, that doesn't make any. Even despite the peculiar challenges of this crisis, we are already seeing a huge upsurge in social solidarity and people reaching out to and helping each other. And we're already seeing a huge upsurge in common sense. People know intuition, and that's why I've been so encouraged that the people in this country have been moving ahead of the government over the last 10 days or so. So hope gets bred by that, it seems to me. My imagining of the best of people is partly based in what I've seen. It's partly based on what I've seen in Extinction Rebellion. If you're not involved in Extinction Rebellion, do consider getting involved. Some of you I know will be at the session we're going to have tomorrow morning, where we're going to talk about this kind of stuff. Being in Extinction Rebellion is hugely enriching as an experience. It's hugely supportive. I mean, it's a human institution, don't get me wrong. XR has its own bullies and stupidities and inefficiencies and so on. But there's a lot of love. There's a lot of mutual support. I remember coming back from the April Rebellion to Norwich last April. Sorry, from the April Rebellion to Norwich when it had ended. And my friend, my close friend Deepak said to me, "Rupert, was this the best fortnight of your life?" And with almost no hesitation, I said yes. And that despite the fact that, some of the time I was absolutely exhausted. Some of the time I was under vicious personal attack in the media. And some of the time I was worried about exhausted. Some of the time I was under vicious personal attack in the media. And some of the time I was worried about possible police violence or whatever. It was very difficult, some of it. It was not the worst of times, but it was a difficult time some of the time, but it was very much the best of times. So I've seen that Extinction Rebellion, and also in the stuff I've studied across the years, I'm well aware of the fact that under conditions of adversity, wonderful things come out in human beings. It's just not true that when human beings are placed in difficult situations, they become all selfish and ruthless and so on. We do see some of that sometimes. We've seen a bit of that in the supermarkets today, people fighting in supermarkets today and pathetic stuff like that. But what we also see a lot of is real, beautiful community building, altruism, people doing things not for the money, but for it being the right thing to do. People maybe I'd just say, it starts here. I want to thank you for being on this call, on this chat, listening to this talk. I found it really useful and interesting, challenging, a new way of doing things. I've enjoyed a lot of your remarks that I've been reading, and I hope you can see in quite a lot of those remarks a lot of ways in which a lot of what you've been saying to each other and to me has been echoing and complementing each other. And a new togetherness always starts here. It always starts right now. It always starts with us. It always starts with how we choose to be. As I said earlier, if you're physically distanced, as more and more of us are going to be for at least a little while, make sure you're building those bonds of solidarity closer. Yeah, I'm just going to end by noticing this lovely thing that Jerry Jacobs has said. I was waiting for XR for years. Yeah, I have the same sense. Thank you, and thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much, Jerry. And she finishes with love to you all. I'll let the stream go on a little bit longer in case anyone wants to write any last remarks on the live chat. After that, you can write in the comments if you need to. And of course, this talk will be available for viewing afterwards at, I believe, the same link as you got onto it by means of. Thank you so much for spending time with me this evening. I really, really appreciate everybody, and I really appreciate your supportive comments. It's so vital to have that feedback when there's not a live crowd in front of me. And again, apologies to those of you who haven't been appreciating my dirty room. I promise you that once I'm locked down, it'll get tidied. Good night, everybody.